I was raised in a home where my father was an alcoholic. When I was little, my first memories of my father was an incident where my dad had been out and he had been drinking, and he came in and he actually told my mother that he was going to shoot her. And then he was going to tie her to the front porch of our home, and he was going to burn her along with my sister and myself inside the home. I remember a gunshot, and I remember my mother crying and picking my sister and myself up and running across the field to a neighbor's house. And it's funny because we think that our children don't remember things, but at 3 and 4 and 5 years old, the memories are vivid when you're in a panic mode and when you're in a survival mode and you're striving for your life. And I knew at that moment that all of that was going on in our surroundings, that my mother was in survival mode and she was in her protective mode and she was saving our lives. The memory that I had is I knew that my mom beat my father to the pistol just by seconds. And had it not been those seconds that made a difference in our lives, our story and our outcome would have been a lot different. My mom took my sister and myself and we went and stayed with our grandparents for quite a long time until my parents reconciled later down the road. My father would always come home and he would come to my mom and he would always ask for forgiveness. It was the same story every time as long as I can remember, that he would never do it again, that nothing would ever go that far, but she always ended up with a bloody lip or a broken rib. After I graduated from high school, I married at a very young age, and my husband and I were transferred to the Houston area with the telephone company. And we had 3 children at that time, and one day out of the blue, I got a phone call from my dad. I was not close to my father, and it's hard for people to understand, but I love my father. Children, no matter if they're coming from an abusive home or not, when they grow up, they love their parents, and the parents, in their own way, fighting through the addiction, love their children. But my dad called me one day, and he had started going to an AA program, and he said, Deb, I can't go back and undo anything in your life that I've done that's taken place, but I can start from today and I can be the best that I can be, and I can be the best grandparent. I hope that you'll forgive me, and I want to tell you that I love you and I've turned my life over to Christ. My father lived for about 7 years longer, and then he died. I remember sitting on the front row of the pew at his funeral. Here was a man who had been so abusive when we were growing up, but he had standing room only at his funeral. My sisters and I and my children sat on the front row, and I watched people, young people, come up and bend over and kiss him and hug him and rub his hand. And I remember feeling so angry because here was a man that had lived his life and was my parent, but I didn't know this man that these people knew and loved. And I felt guilt, I felt cheated, I felt robbed, and I felt jealousy that here they knew a loving, giving man, but I had the father who had the addiction of alcoholism. I remember thinking at the time, here was a man who had 3 ministers who talked at his funeral and praised him about all the changes he had made with his life and the people's lives that he had touched. And I remember thinking that possibly I didn't have enough friends or had made enough impact on people in a positive way that I might not even be able to fill up a church pew. But here was a man who filled up the church twice. I remember that the anger that I felt so strong, and it wasn't until years later that God showed me through my own Christian walk that he used my dad where he could use him. He could have spent all those years talking to me and asking for my forgiveness and doing and saying all the right things, But my heart was so hardened towards him that I wasn't at a place in my life where I was willing to forgive him. And then I realized years later that God used him where he could make a difference. And he acted it through, it was basically like a buddy system through AA, and there were young servicemen with 3 naval bases there in Jacksonville, Florida. And he acted as a drug and alcohol counselor because he so understood. He became an alcoholic while he was in the military, and he was stationed in Korea. So he knew what these people felt. And he said only someone who's been at the place where they've been can understand what they're going on and what's going on through their minds at that time. I thought about it, and I know that God revealed to me later on that it would have been a waste of his life, a waste of the time that he had left to try to come back and make it up to my sisters and myself, because we were not at a place in our life where we were willing to act on that forgiveness. You can come out on the other side a stronger individual than you've ever been. People who've gone through a valley and then come out on the other side can make such a tremendous impact. If you don't let your pride stand in the way and you can be humbled, God will use you to make an impact on other people's lives. I know that he used my dad, and I know that his addiction could have destroyed him, and it did destroy a family. But this is still a message of hope, that on the other side of that, you come out a stronger individual, and God will use you in a mighty, mighty way.